Albert Fish. Hamilton Howard Albert Fish, born May 19, 1870. Sex pervert, including cannibalism, coprophilia, urophilia, pedophilia, and masochism. An American sadomasochistic serial killer and cannibal. He was also known as the Gray Man, the werewolf of Wisteria, and possibly the Brooklyn Vampire. He boasted that he had children in every state, putting the figure at around 100. Although it's not clear whether he was talking about molestation or cannibalization, less still as to whether it was true or not. He was a suspect in at least 5 killings in his lifetime. In 1910, Fish fell into a sadomasochistic relationship with a 19-year-old man by the name of Thomas Kedden. It wasn't long before Fish took things too far. He brought Kedden to an abandoned barn and proceeded to torture him for 2 weeks. The culmination? Fish tied up Kedden and cut off half of his penis. He recounts, "I shall never forget his scream, or the look that he gave me." Fish had planned to kill Kedden and cut his body into pieces, but the fear of being caught overtook him. Instead, he disinfected the wound, covered it with petroleum jelly, gave Kedden a kiss, and fled. Whatever became of Kedden is unknown. On May 25, 1928, Edward Budd put a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." On May 28, 1928, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan, New York City, under the pretense of hiring Edward. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. When he arrived, Fish met Budd's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace. Fish promised to hire Budd and said he would send him in for a few days. On his second visit, he agreed to hire Budd and then convinced his parents, Delia Flanagan and Albert Budd, to let Grace accompany him to a birthday party that evening at his sister's home. Albert Sr. was a porter for the Equitable Life Assurance Society. Grace had a sister, Beatrice, and 2 older brothers, Albert Budd II and George Budd. Fish left with Grace that day, but he never came back. 7 years later, in November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to the girl's parents, which led the police to Albert Fish. The letter is quoted here, with all of Fish's misspellings and grammatical errors. Dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind was $1 to $3 per pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7 and one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy, because he had the fattest ass, and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten, except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, near the right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, and I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester, which I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. Oh, how she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her into small pieces so I could make my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not have her, though. I could have if I wished. She died a virgin. Mrs. Budd was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it instead. Fish later admitted to his attorney that he did indeed rape Grace. Fish was a compulsive liar, however, so this may be untrue. He had told the police, when asked, that it never entered his head to rape the girl. The trial lasted 10 days, and the jury took less than an hour to reach its verdict. "We find the defendant guilty as charged," the foreman said. Fish was not happy with the verdict, but the prospect of being electrocuted had an appeal to him. A Daily News reporter wrote, "His watery eyes gleamed at the thought of being burned by a heat more intense than the flames which he had often seared his flesh to gratify his lust." Fish arrived in March of 1935 and was executed on January 16, 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. He was recorded to have said that the electrocution would be the supreme thrill of his life. Just before the switch was flipped, he stated, "I don't even know why I'm here." Legend has it that his execution took longer due to the numerous needles inserted into his privates which disrupted the flow of electricity.